Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jennifer King and I serve as the director of the Stuart A. Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library. It is such an honor to be here today to celebrate collections and connections with each other and Jewish history here in the Rose Library at Emory University. The occasion for this gathering is the official launch of the Geffen and Lewyn Family Southern Jewish Collections Research Fellowship and the opening of the newly processed Southern Jewish History Collections. This afternoon has been a long time coming. While I only met Rabbi David Geffen in person for the first time yesterday with his son Avi, we have been corresponding regularly for the last 4 years. During that time, I've learned a tremendous amount about the Geffen family in Atlanta and Southern Jewish history, thanks to Rabbi David Geffen's deep passion. A passion that was nurtured by his parents, Louis and Anna Geffen, who donated the Geffen family's papers to the library in 1987. In 1989, 33 years ago, the library hosted a program to open that collection. Over the course of the intervening years, the Rose Library has acquired prominent Jewish collections that include the Morris B. Abram papers, American Jewish Committee Atlanta Oral History Interviews, David Blumenthal papers, Isaac Don Levine papers, Jacob M. Rothschild papers, and, in 2010, the Lewyn cousins donated the Burton Esther Lewyn papers. With generous financial support from the Geffen and Lewyn family, a team of archivists who included Tiara Thomas, Sarah Quigley, Becky Sherman, and student Allison Stickley Minor have fully processed the Burton Esther Lewyn papers, Jack Boozer papers, and are continuing work on the Morris Abram papers. Their support has also allowed us to establish the Geffen and Lewyn Family Southern Jewish Collections Research Fellowship, a competitive award offered annually each spring to support the costs associated with visiting the Rose Library to use these important collections. Before we start this afternoon's program, I want to acknowledge the Muskogee Creek people who lived, worked, produced knowledge on, and nurtured the land where Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses are now located. I also want to acknowledge the Lewyn and Geffen families, especially Rabbi David Geffen and Mark Lewyn, who have been incredible partners to the Rose Library, Aaron Harini-Ogle, Chief Development Officer for the library, who has been behind the scenes and a true partner in working with the Geffen and Lewyns to establish this research fellowship, the CCR team, the Rose team, and Lisa Macklin, Associate Vice Provost and University Librarian, for her support, as well as the former Dean of the Library, Linda Matthews, who's actually here today. I also want to acknowledge and offer thanks to the TAM Center for Jewish Studies, especially to Eric Goldstein, Miriam Udell, and Paul Entis for their support, and to the leaders from Atlanta Jewish organizations, including Rabbi Ari Kamen from Congregation Shearith Israel. We are so happy you're here. Joining us today is the library's new Vice Provost for Libraries and Museum, Dr. Valida Dent. And without further ado, the president of Emory University, Gregory Fenves, will offer a few remarks and then introduce Melissa Fay Greene, who will be followed by brief remarks from Rabbi David Geffen. Rabbi David Geffen, 59C, was the rabbi of Congregation Beth Shalom in Wilmington, Delaware, and Beth Shalom in Scranton, Pennsylvania, before settling in Israel with his wife Rita and family. Those of you who watched President Joe Biden's Rosh Hashanah celebration at the White House this fall would have heard the President of the United States recognize David for his service and influence on Jewish life in Delaware. Also joining us is Mark Lewyn, financial advisor and former Emory Board of Visitors member, who has placed his family papers at the Rose. Thank you so much, President Fenves, for being with us this afternoon and for introducing our event.
Thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. This is a very special day for Emory. First, a little biography. I grew up in Illinois, the eldest son in a Jewish family, and my early impressions of Jewish American life were largely shaped by my experiences in Chicago, where my extended family lived. Our cultural references and affinities, the food, music, art, and entertainment we loved, our sense of identity, and tradition as Jews were linked to the energy and spirit of my family in the Midwest. Then going to college in upstate New York, I learned a lot about Jewish life, both upstate and downstate in New York, as they say there. Then graduate school in the San Francisco area introduced me to California's Jewish community. So, as you might guess, in all that time, it never occurred to me that a person could be both Southern and Jewish. It was only when I moved to Austin for my first job after graduate school that I began to glimpse the rich traditions and strong presence Jews have had within the American South. And in the years after that, I kept noticing something. There was this one university whose name consistently came up as an intellectual hub for Jewish thought and higher learning in the South. Can you guess what that university was? Emory, of course. So today, as Emory's first Jewish president, it gives me great pride to celebrate the opening of the renewed and refreshed Southern Jewish history collections in our fabulous Rose Library, and to launch the Geffen and Lewyn Families Research Fellowship, which provides opportunities for students, scholars, and authors to research Southern Jewish families, culture, business, activism, and politics. None of this would have been possible without the generosity and vision of the Lewyn and Geffen families, whose own histories are inextricably linked to Emory. Let me tell you a quick story, one I learned just yesterday after meeting Andy Lewin-Kravofsky, who told me about the early days of the Emory campus here in Atlanta, which opened in 1919. Shortly thereafter, Rabbi Tobias Geffen came to Warren Candler with a problem. Of course, Bishop Candler was a former Emory College president and instrumental in bringing Emory to Atlanta with the help of his brother, Asa Candler, the founder of the Coca-Cola company. Rabbi Geffen wanted his son Joel to attend Emory, but he was worried because some of the classes were scheduled on Saturdays, and as an Orthodox Jew, Joel wouldn't be able to write or take notes on the Sabbath. Graciously, the university offered to help. So over the next 18 years, Joel and many of his siblings would attend Emory. On Saturdays, they would go to class and listen, and then get notes afterwards from their peers. If there was a test scheduled, an alternate date would be arranged for them. And I want you to keep in mind, this was happening during the 1920s, a period rife with anti-Semitism, including the popularization of the Protocols of Elders of Zion, the hateful forgery exported in the early days of the Soviet Union. Despite that, the Geffen family found support and compassion from a Methodist university in Atlanta, Georgia. The key elements of their history are preserved here in this very archive, including the Bert and Esther Lewin papers, which among other things chronicle Bert Lewin's experiences as a Holocaust survivor. The stories of the Lewin and Geffen families help to shed light on the story of our nation through a Jewish lens, a Southern Jewish lens. And with this archive and fellowship, scholars will get the chance to uncover the distinct traditions, challenges, and contributions the Jews have made in the South for hundreds of years. This important slice of American history is not as widely known as it should be, but here at Emory, we are going to make these stories accessible and give scholars the opportunity to study them and to spread this knowledge of the Southern Jewish experience far and wide. So with that said, let's have a big round of applause for the Geffen and Lewin families for helping to bring this amazing archive back to life. Now, please welcome award-winning nonfiction author, journalist, and professor at Agnes Scott College and the University of Georgia, Melissa Fay Greene.
The library gave me a local researcher card, and that enabled me to learn some of these stories that I'll share with you. At 3:30 in the morning of October 12th, 1958, 50 sticks of dynamite blasted open the side of the temple. It was Atlanta's oldest and largest synagogue, sitting on a grassy hill above Peachtree Street. The stone walls flapped upward like sheets on a line. Offices and Sunday school classrooms flowed out of the building. The stairwell came unmoored and hung like a rope ladder. All right, this is not advancing.
There you go.
Don't leave me. It's still not advancing, should I do that? No.
We're experiencing difficulties with Zoom at the moment. So
There we go. How'd you do? Okay, don't go far.
Okay.
The bronze plaques commemorating the war dead from the 2 world wars spun out like saucers. The stained glass windows snapped outward like tablecloths shaken after dinner, and all was momentarily liquid, red hot, white lit, and moving like lava. The sound of the blast traveled heavily for miles, a locomotive of sound tearing through the city. At 3:45 a.m., UPI had received a call from a so-called General Gordon of the Confederate Underground. Quote, "We bombed a temple in Atlanta. This is the last empty building in Atlanta that we will bomb. All nightclubs refusing to fire their Negro employees will also be blown up. We're going to blow up all communist organizations. Negroes and Jews are hereby declared aliens." On May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court had ruled that states could not lawfully segregate school children by race. From that day on, hundreds of homemade bombs killed and injured scores of people and demolished property. There were whippings and lynchings of Black citizens. It was a chaotic era in which hate speech filled the airwaves and the newspapers. Governor Herman Talmadge of Georgia promised to call out the state militia to safeguard the segregated schools. Quote, "So far as I'm concerned," he said, "Georgia is going to resist mixing races in the school if it's the only state to do so," end quote. The Georgia legislature passed a constitutional amendment to discontinue public education. Angry white men formed new secret organizations where ties of race and blood superseded ties of nation and citizenship. They joined Ku Klux Klans, states' rights parties, white citizens' councils. They read newspapers like the Thunderbolt, the White Man's Viewpoint, published by George Lincoln Rockwell. Headlines and stories reported Jewish control of the NAACP, the White House, the Supreme Court, and Hollywood, and the Holocaust was denounced as a giant propaganda hoax. When my husband, Don Samuel, and I, he's here, first moved to Rome, Georgia in 1979, we happily introduced ourselves to our new next door neighbors, and they seemed pleased, but it turned out they had never met Jews before, and they subscribed to the Thunderbolt, the White Man's Viewpoint. They began bringing it over in the evenings for fact checking. Was it true, they asked one day, that all Jews got a kickback whenever an unsuspecting Gentile bought a food product with a kosher sign on it? "No, that's not true," I said. But then Donna yelled from the other room, "Honey, did our dividend check arrive yet this month?" We have old friends from Rome here. Our neighbors couldn't tell what was Jewish, what was urban, what was educated. They just couldn't tell. They were trying to get the hang of it. They came over one evening and we were steaming artichokes, and our neighbor, Steve Long, went up and just wanted to take a look and opened it, and he sprang back. He said, "Okay, I know, it's some kind of Jew food, right?" 500,000 white Southerners enlisted in the massive resistance to the Supreme Court decision. All sorts of anti-Semitic demons were let out of the closet at the same time, including the belief that Jewish communists were organizing the civil rights movement. The temple bombing was the 47th bombing or attempted bombing in the South in a year. It was the 7th that year with a Jewish target. In the 1950s and 60s, 10% of the bombs of the white supremacists hit synagogues, rabbis' houses, and JCCs. The chief target of the temple bombing was a Pittsburgh-born Reform rabbi, Jacob M. Rothschild, who was home asleep at the time of the blast. His papers are upstairs. He was 47 years old, a World War II veteran, a fair-skinned, balding man with black eyeglasses. He'd been the first Jewish chaplain to come under fire in the Second World War. He'd been hired by the temple in 1946, as much for his secular qualifications as for any from seminary. He was an avid tennis player, football player, bridge player, and baseball fan. He was a witty conversationalist, and he liked to ride horses. He and Rabbi Emanuel Feldman of Atlanta's Orthodox Beth Jacob famously went horseback riding together. No one in the Jewish community could believe it. One day at a communal event attended by both rabbis, a local man named Frank Garson felt compelled to confirm the rumor. He asked Rabbi Feldman, "Is it true that you ride horseback with Rothschild?" "Sure I do," said the long-bearded pious rabbi. "You think only Reform rabbis can ride horses?" "No," said Garson, "but when a Reform rabbi falls off a horse and you say the rabbi fell off a horse, people will say, the rabbi fell off a horse? Oh my God, was he hurt?" But if the Orthodox rabbi falls off a horse and you say the rabbi fell off a horse, the people will say, the rabbi fell off a horse? What was the rabbi doing on a horse? I got this story upstairs in the archives. The Jews of the temple were German Jews, a cultivated and upwardly mobile community. Some of the members were descended from Revolutionary War officers. Others were descended from Atlanta's founding families. Many saw themselves as Southerners who just happened to be Jewish. The Southern Jews represented less than 0.5% of the population of the region. In their distance from the great Jewish communities then of Europe and of New York, and in their eagerness to fit into the sea of Gentiles, they took on some protective coloration. In Southern synagogues, most of which ended up joining the Reform movement, in part because that's who would send circuit riding rabbis. Circuit riding rabbis came from HUC in Cincinnati. English hymns were sung by choirs and organ music was played. At the temple in Atlanta, they addressed their rabbi as doctor rather than rabbi because rabbi sounded too Jewish. It was said for years that the only people at the temple who knew any Hebrew were the Christian choir members. The temple became one of about a dozen Reform congregations in the country to organize Sunday morning worship service. They were trying to appear more like the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians, less so the Methodists and not at all the Baptists. The Episcopalians and the Presbyterians is what they wanted, but they ran into trouble with it because the Christian choir members wanted to be free to worship at their home congregations. Across the region, there were Bootsies and Bubbas and Lurleens with last names like Rosenfeld. For those Southern Reform Jews who served a Friday night dinner, the menu might involve pork chops with okra, tomatoes, and black-eyed peas. At the Passover Seder, many Southern Jews served a plate of matzah at one end of the table and a basket of biscuits at the other. The Brotherhood of Temple Sinai in New Orleans held an annual shrimp boil. In Baton Rouge, a Reform congregation had an annual crawfish boil. And in Brookhaven, Mississippi, there was a High Holy Day shrimp fry. The needs of the temple board who hired Rothschild were not especially spiritual, but social, political, economic. Atlanta was a city on the make. Its leaders bent on making it the economic capital of the South. The German Jews of the temple knew the mercantile world, mortgage brokering, textiles, law. The question for them was whether the local white Protestant power elite would let them aid the city's business progress, or whether they would be held at bay as tainted, talented outsiders. So they chose Rothschild, the veteran, the athlete, the jokester, a regular guy who just happened to be a rabbi. He came to Atlanta from Pittsburgh in 1946, but was immediately shocked by Jim Crow, by segregation. He hadn't seen it before. By 1947, he began to make sermons on what was then called the Negro question. The quest to overthrow segregation came to occupy so great a portion of his time and thoughts that near the end of his life, he would say it had been his greatest cause. Rabbi Rothschild supported integration and said so publicly and angrily in sermons, speeches, and editorials. He invited Black speakers onto his pulpit and Black dinner guests into his home. Janice Rothschild Blumberg, who's part of this project, but is not here right now, told me about the night that the Rothschild invited the Kings to dinner. They invited Reverend and Martin and Coretta King to come to dinner in their home in the Lenox neighborhood. But the streets were kind of curvy, it was dimly lit, and the Kings lost their way. They couldn't see the address on the houses. The Kings told Janice, who told me, that they had to stop to ask directions, but in order not to embarrass the Rothschilds in front of their white neighbors, Coretta posed as a waitress who was going to wait at a party, and that's how they got directions to the Rothschilds. And what stood behind it, one felt with Rothschild, was not muscle or rugged good looks, the kind of things that would do you some good in a crowd. Among the tall, handsome, silver-templed Atlanta ministers Rothschild looked somewhat the four eyes, the egghead, the bookworm, but he'd seen bloodshed on Guadalcanal. He'd sat with dying boys, Jewish and Christian, in hospital tents as bombs fell. What stood behind the eloquence and the quietly revolutionary actions was a clarity of mind and a history of having not flinched under fire. Asked more than once in question and answer sessions and on call-in radio programs. He was often a radio guest. He was often invited to speak in churches around town. What's your favorite Bible verse, Rabbi? He offered immediately Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8. Then I heard the voice of my Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, here am I, send me. Unfortunately, for many members of the temple, oh, I think I advanced this wrong. That was all supposed to be here. Unfortunately, for many members of the temple, the thought that their rabbi felt God was sending him to speak for integration was not good news. Jewish Southerners, not surprisingly, were mostly silent during the mayhem and violence that erupted after the Brown decision. One rabbi who served in a Southern pulpit for 30 years observed, sure, there are some biased people, but by and large, Jews are sympathetic to civil rights. They just don't want to stick their necks out. Many feared that if they spoke up for civil equality, violent racists would come after them. Jewish merchants in small Southern towns, often the only Jews in the county, felt especially vulnerable. Joe Jacobs, a great old labor lawyer in the city. Did anyone know Joe Jacobs? Told me a story about the day the Klan came into a small town in Mississippi. It sounds like part of a body of Southern Jewish humor. I'm sure there are more treasures hosted upstairs here. So the Klan rides into town and begins to organize, Joe says. They get everybody together. And Sam runs the only grocery store in town. And Sam has decided that he ain't gonna go. His good Baptist friend who runs the drugstore comes in and says, Sam, we didn't see you at the meeting. He says, well, I just didn't go. You know, he's not going to make waves. So he says, we're getting organized. Filling station man is joining, insurance man is joining, all the business people are joining. Sam, you ought to join. No, says Sam, you go, you'll enjoy. Sam, you ought to come. Well, he says, I'll see. Finally, Sam goes. Everybody signs up and pays their $10 membership and $15 for the sheets. This is still Joe Jacobs' story, but there's a side joke here, which was why didn't more Jews join the Klan? They knew better than to pay $15 for sheets with holes in them. Here's Joe Jacobs. Sam is still holding back. The pharmacist comes over. See, everybody's joining. Sam, how about it? You ought to do it for business. You got to do it. All right, he finally says. So he goes over and signs up. The man who signs him up says, see now, Sam, at $10 you paid guarantees your daughter will never marry a black man. Really, says Sam, cheering up. I'll tell you what, here's another $10. She should never marry any of you, Michigan Goyim. Every time one of you makes a speech, a Southern woman told the ADL staff, I'm afraid my husband's store will be burnt up the next morning. The Waycross, Georgia chapter of B'nai B'rith seceded from the national organization. This was the era when Jews made up whatever it was, 25, 50% of the freedom riders coming into the South. It scared the Southern Jews. The fact is they weren't wrong. In a typical speech before a white Citizens Council rally in Memphis, for example, a speaker said, quote, the NAACP is the worst organization to come along since the one that crucified Christ. And I may as well say it, it's the same organization, end quote. Subject to repeated warnings, to be circumspect, to be moderate, to be careful by his fellow rabbis across the South and around the nation and by his own congregants. And the archives has boxes of letters from the congregants. Rothschild wrote to a friend in March 1958, if this is dangerous, then I shall have to live dangerously because I firmly believe it's my responsibility as a rabbi. And even if I weren't a rabbi, would be my responsibility as a human being. Don't think that I like endangering the security of our institutions and even my family, God forbid, but I'm here and life requires it, and so be it. A man named George Bright, on the far left here, was one of 5 arrested for the bombing, all members of the National States Rights Party. founded by J.B. Stoner and Ed Fields. I was able to visit this man numerous times. He lived in an abandoned looking place with a steep, wild yard, boarded up windows, a plastic garbage can in the front yard, and no soliciting signs everywhere. He was a retired cotton mill engineer. 10 minutes into my first visit, I just thought this was such a pathetic individual. I just should invite him for dinner. But then he shared his thoughts. People of a temperate climate have contributed 99.9% of all the advancement of mankind, he told me. Quote, race mixing is the downfall of civilization. If you don't love your own race, you don't love anything. That's what made the world, and that's what keep us going, the purity of the races, end quote. His philosophy, which was that of the National States Rights Party, was that the Jews wanted to rule the world and that their strategy was organizing the civil rights movement. He said, the Jews bombed their own temple. Obviously, no one got hurt, did they? Why else would you bomb an empty building? The Jews bombed it themselves for all the sympathy it would get them. Oh, yes, and there was Rothschild. He was the chief Jew in Atlanta, a Jew in favor of civil rights. But he came up against a brick wall among the Anglo-Saxons, including me, end quote. I decided not to invite him to dinner. Rabbi Rothschild was no hysteric. At the bomb site early that Sunday morning, his demeanor was flat. He'd been psychologically flirting with the bomb throwers for nearly a year now. Maybe if we talk about it, we'll be bombed too, he had said in a sermon in May from these archives. He consciously had thrown the switches and turned the wheels known to excite the South's violent extremists. He'd spoken in favor of racial integration. Now he had crossed a great divide. He had made common cause with the civil rights movement. Whether it would estrange him from his fellow Jews, including his own congregants, he didn't know yet. On the marquee, on the lawn, in front of the temple, the rabbi directed the staff to announce the title of his forthcoming sermon the Friday night after the bombing, and none shall make them afraid. That Friday night, the sanctuary was packed, and it was never packed on Friday nights. Friday nights were just usually a sprinkling of folks observing a yard site. That Friday night, packed. These congregants who had complained and muttered about Jacob Rothschild's obsession with the civil rights movement for a decade evidently felt it was one thing for them to scold their rabbi, but damned if they were going to let raving, lunatic, racist, violent anti-Semites tell their rabbi what he could and couldn't talk about. So it was a standing room only crowd. Rabbi Rothschild approached the podium, scanned the rows of anxious or scared or resolute faces. Have I mentioned he had a sense of humor? Oh, he says, so this is what it takes to get you to come to temple. I'll close with one last story. On October 14th, 1964, the news came from Oslo that the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah, it was kind of like there's good news and there's bad news, the former vice mayor told me of the reaction of the city government. Quote, the good news, and Atlanta just won the Nobel Prize. The bad news, it's King, end quote. To most of the world, he was being looked upon as a new Gandhi, said former Mayor Ivan Allen Jr. Continuing the quote, the reaction was different in much of the white South. We had made some strides in civil rights, but we hadn't come that far. There was still a lot of bitterness inside the Atlanta business community toward Dr. King's successful efforts to desegregate public facilities. And so the awarding of the Nobel Prize brought the haters out of the woodwork again, end quote. Black leaders proposed that the city of Atlanta host a banquet to honor the city's Nobel laureate. It could be held downtown in the Dinkler Hotel, which had the largest ballroom in the city. Even though the Dinkler was white only, that could change. The Black leaders invited 4 men to chair and host the dinner. Ralph McGill, publisher of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, president of Morehouse, Paul J. Hallinan, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Atlanta, who basically came from his deathbed for this last work, and Rabbi Jacob Rothschild. Mayor Allen was pessimistic about the business elite supporting it, and he was right. The first 125 business leaders declined buying seats at a table for this gala. Robert J. Woodruff, it's the same, The retired director of Coca-Cola, then 75, had repeatedly said he didn't want his company to be embarrassed by its hometown. He asked the mayor to convene a meeting to rally the business elite. The 24 bankers, lawyers, and businessmen sullenly met at the white-only, Protestant-only Piedmont Driving Club and were asked by the mayor on behalf of Coca-Cola to buy tickets to a gala honoring Dr. King. Their grumbled responses lacked enthusiasm. Many made private calls complaining about Woodruff's intervention. Banquet to honor Dr. King sets off quiet dispute in Atlanta, read the New York Times headline a few days later, making the dispute a public one. Immediately, several Atlanta businesses got pushback from some of their global clients. The government of Haiti threatened to cancel its business with Citizens and Southern Bank of Atlanta. It was just as Woodruff had warned. If Atlanta treated Dr. King shabbily, the world would notice, and Atlanta companies attempting to make inroads in the developing world would be set back. Rabbi Rothschild lamented to his son, "Why can't they just do it because it's right?" The president of C&S Bank, hoping to do business with Haiti, bought a block of tickets to the dinner and others followed. The tickets began to be seen as hot items. After all the foot dragging and opposition, 1,463 people gathered to honor Dr. King in the largest banquet hall in the city. The rabbi said we had to turn away many prominent citizens who leaped too late on the bandwagon. Outside the Dinkler Hotel that night, a few Klansmen showed up to picket, but they were jostled aside by throngs of fashionable partygoers and reporters. The protesters resentfully watched the arrival of dignitaries as at a movie premiere. For those with tickets, the little slips of paper that couldn't be given away by the boxload a month earlier, but now twinkled in the bearers' hands like diamonds on their rings and bracelets. The evening grew more intoxicating the closer they got to their seats at the elegantly laid long tables. High society ladies in ball gowns found themselves seated beside an African-American minister and his wife, or beside a domestic worker, or here was a sharp young professor from Morehouse, or a gray-haired Black physician and his wife. "Oh," the white women politely inquired, "you go to his church? You were with him in Birmingham? You've practiced medicine in Atlanta for 30 years? You teach romanticism? It was unheard of." There was the natural uneasiness that would come at a first biracial gathering like this, said Mayor Allen. That night, it was as if the Black Atlantans were from another country, since they were abruptly to be treated with respect. It was a night of satisfaction and secret hilarity for the Black diners, who displayed to their bewildered white dinner partners every one of the refined arts of dining and conversation. When we arrived at the hotel that night, we beheld a beautiful sight, said Coretta Scott King. The ballroom was filled with Negroes and whites from all levels, judges and top-ranking industrialists sitting at the same tables with cooks and porters. 10 years, 5 years, even 1 year before, such a sight would have been unthinkable, end quote. Rabbi Rothschild opened the festivities. He presented Dr. King with the city's gift, an engraved Lenox glass bowl designed by Janice Rothschild. It was a moment of unspeakable fulfillment, Dr. King, and he should treasure for the rest of his life the sight of the beautifully integrated audience before him in his hometown in the heart of the segregated South. When he finished speaking, the audience gave him a standing ovation, then launched into song. At the end, said Rabbi Rothschild, almost 1,500 people, white and Black, Jew and Christian, rich and poor, humble workers and great ladies, rose, joined hands, and sang, "We shall overcome," end quote. The whites, rather remarkably, perhaps it was from having seen TV footage, knew the melody and the verses. Martin Luther King spun a great many glorious metaphors in the course of his oratory. In his words, you heard of the yoke of oppression, the beacon light of hope, the superhighway of justice, the ringing of freedom, the locomotive of history. But it was the words he'd cried out 18 months earlier, standing before the Lincoln Memorial, that stirred in the minds of the guests that night as they stepped for an enchanted hour into the dreamt of world. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, he'd sung out, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood, end quote. That night, they turned up at the door, found their tables, pulled out their chairs, sat down and ate. They ate at the table of brotherhood. I will close with a passage from modern Jewish liturgy, an insight I often gave thought to when thinking about the lives of Rabbi Rothschild and George Bright and the thousands of others who had to choose sides at mid-century. Quote, "The God we worship writes his name on our faces," it goes, "and a person will worship something, have no doubt of that either. One may think that tribute is paid in secret in the dark recesses of his or her heart, but it is not. That which dominates imagination and thoughts will determine life and character. Therefore, it behooves us to be careful what we are worshiping. For what we are worshiping, we are becoming." Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. And thank you again to the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library that enabled me to learn about and tell this story.
I'm only going to use the last quote that I have in my speech because, thank you, Mr. President. You are the first person, the first president who ever told that story about my grandfather. So thank you very much. I'm going to fill in a few spaces that are not in the archives. Hopefully after today, they will be. The first is before Rabbi Rothschild and Janice had Martin Luther King and Coretta at their home, something else was going on with a student here at Emory. Her name is Lois Frank. She's sitting right here. So Lois Frank told me this story. They have a home in Jerusalem, close to where we live, before various changes happened in our family. So Lois told me this story. You won't find it in the Emory archives anywhere. Nobody here at Emory, except the Wheel, the student newspaper, wanted it told. Lois Frank was in student group that brought speakers to the campus. So I don't know if she'd ever met him before. Lois Frank called up Reverend King, and she said, "Reverend King, I'd like for you and your wife to come out to Emory, and Reverend King, we'd appreciate your speaking." This is in 1962. Well, anyway, how did Lois pick them up to bring them here? Lois had a little Volkswagen. The Kings rode with Lois in her Volkswagen here to the Emory campus. Well, what Lois had done was she had arranged a room in the Alumni Memorial Building, which when my son was driving around the campus, I saw the name of it. So she arranged a room. The room might have held 50, 60, maybe that. So Lois brings them onto the campus with her Volkswagen. There were police around, Emory police, no Atlanta police, because I don't even think the Atlanta Police Department knew that Martin Luther King and his wife were coming here to Emory, because Emory didn't let them know. So anyway, what happens? Somehow the word got out, and the people, first the students, and then other people poured into the campus, poured in. By the time Reverend King was ready to speak, there were 1,500 people, 1,500 people right near the Alumni Memorial Building. Reverend King spoke. I can't remember whether Lois told me there were questions asked, but everybody was cheering and everything of that nature. I don't know if any professors were there. Surely no one from the staff of Emory was present that evening. So anyway, today we know you have a camera, you take a picture. There are no pictures. There are no pictures of Reverend King being on the Emory campus. In addition, nobody in the Atlanta newspapers knew anything about it. It was before Ralph McGill began to get involved with this. No one knew, the Constitution or the Journal. So anyway, what happened was, it was a wonderful evening. It was an introduction for the Kings, one to Emory and two for Atlanta, And it was a wonderful evening. But Emory did not want it known. Emory did not want it known. It's not in any of their records. The only place that there is a story, and somebody, because I know some people in the archives here, they found it in the Emory Wheel 8 days after it occurred, 8 days. So anyway, what I have to say is this: Lois is the one who did it, but thankfully the police, who had thrown people off the Agnes Scott campus when King spoke, they threw them off. Fortunately, the police let Martin Luther King speak. And so the police at Emory ought to be congratulated. Okay, so that's one. In addition, a couple of things that happened when I was a student here. You may remember the name, or you remember the concept, Professor Thomas Altizer. Okay, Professor Thomas Altizer, back in the early mid-50s, he came here to Emory. I'm not going to tell you the story how he got here, but he came here to Emory. And he said, and he proved, God is dead. So Newsweek poured into Emory, Time Magazine, even the New Yorker, they poured in, and there were many, many stories. I had sat in, because he taught a couple of classes, I sat in his classes. Clearly, we didn't have many Jews on the campus then. So he knew I was a Jew. Anyway, number of years later, I come to visit my parents from Israel, and we go to a play. Then it was called the Alliance Theater. I don't know what it's called today. Anyway, at the intermission, I see Professor Altizer in the crowd. So I go over to him, shake his hand, introduce myself. He smiles at me and he says, David, you're the only rabbi I ever taught. All right, anyway, I got, as Mark Bauman knows, the gentleman who put together the study of Southern Jewish history, and he's sitting here somewhere. Anyway, he knows that all I do in my room in Jerusalem is I look at open up archives, newspaper archives from communities all over, primarily the South, but I've done some other places as well. So I'm not going to give you any more of those, but what I do want to end with is the following. My philosophy. I believe that every person is very important. But how do you know about that person when he or she is gone? The only way you can know about them if there is an archives, big or small, of their lives. Well, anyway, what I have tried to do, and I had some success, I talk to people and I say, please deposit your archives before you die, because your children will throw them all away. So anyway, I hope and I pray that many, many more people will save their archive and preserve them. And if I can find it. Okay, you know I'm a rabbi, so what I do in the pieces that I write, oftentimes I find a poem or another prose piece which I include. So anyway, the following poem was used when my grandchildren, Ori and Hila, got married in Israel at the end of June 2020. And I quote, "For me to have made one soul the better for my birth, to have added one flower in the garden of the earth, to have struck one blow for truth in the daily fight with lies, to have done one deed of right in the face of calumny." That's not the right pronunciation. "To have sown in the souls of men and women one thought that will not die, to have been a link in the chain of life, shall be my immortality. We are all linked in the chain of life." Thank you.
Boy, it's hard to follow that one, but I'll try. First of all, I just want to share how excited I am that I have been invited to Lois Frank's house for dinner. And so who knows who will show up there. Anyway, good afternoon. Thanks for coming to everyone here and also in our worldwide virtual audience. Thanks for tuning in. And thanks to President Fenves, to Ms. Greene, Rabbi Geffen, our wonderful Emory team, Jennifer and Aaron, and to all members of the extended Geffen and Lewyn families, and especially to my mom, Esther Lewyn, who is sitting right over there. And of course, thank you to all the great men and women who have donated their precious documents to the Emory collection, and to all those who hopefully will in the future. In my mercifully brief remarks today, I want to share my take on how we got here and why we think this is all so valuable and important. My dad, Bert Lewyn, whose family documents are part of this collection, was like President Fenves' father, a Holocaust survivor. Every survivor has a fascinating story. Bert's story is he survived the entire war on the streets of Berlin after his parents were deported in 1942. I thought I would read a few hundred pages from each one of these books. But since we don't have the time to do so, I just thought I would acknowledge my wife, Bev Salzman Lewyn, who wrote On the Run in Nazi Berlin, the first edition, which came out in 2001, and the German edition, which came out in 2009, and the updated edition recently in 2019. My dad has also been noted in other literature, including Hitler Youth by Susan Bartlett Susan Bartolotti, excuse me. And just recently, this came over the transom, and I'm going to embarrass myself by attempting German. My daughter Rebecca, student of German, could do a lot better, but this is called Die Unbekannten Judenhelfer, which is the unknown helper of the Jews. It's by the German author Christoph Wilker. These books and many other documents featuring the subsequent family and business life in Atlanta from 1949 to 2016 will form the basis for the Lewyn family papers housed here at Emory. But how did we get here today? It's a 70-year journey, beginning with Rabbi Tobias Geffen, David's grandfather, in an ultimate and astounding act of kindness, rescued and sponsored his nephew, Dagobert Lewyn, my father, from Feldafing, a German displaced persons camp, bringing him here to Atlanta in 1949. And Bert, lived with Rabbi and Mrs. Geffen until 1951. What happened next after he arrived? Family lore has it that Mrs. Geffen, the rabbi's wife, alerted all single girls in the congregation that the immigrant had arrived. And for the next several months, Mrs. Geffen hosted many girls until Bert protested, agreeing to meet only one more. And that was my mom, Esther Lewyn. So the firm link with the Geffen family was solidified and finds its full flowering today. The next step, 70 years later, came during the mourning period following my dad's death in 2016. Emory law professor and Rabbi Michael Broyd came to our house and shared his view that I needed to think about a permanent way to honor my dad. After further conversations with family, friends, including fellow Emory professors Edward Queen, Joseph Skybell, and Michael Berger of Emory, and of course, Rabbi David Geffen and multiple other Geffens, the Geffen-Lewyn collection was born. Finally, as I reflect on the threads connecting the shared history of President Fenves, the story of the temple, the synagogue where I grew up, and the Rothschild family, the Geffen and Lewyn families, and all of the families and institutions that make up the current and future collection, I believe that the best lessons of the future, like Rabbi David Geffen just alluded to, can be found in the past. And so speaking for the Geffen and Lewyn families, I thank Emory and all of you for the opportunity to be part of this great opportunity to make those lessons available to all.
So with that, I want to thank you so much, everyone who came together today to hear these incredible, moving, inspiring stories. I thank you, Mark. I thank you, David. I thank you, President Fenves. And I thank Melissa for teaching us what some of us don't always have the time to go discover in the archives upstairs, but the truths in the archives are worth knowing, worth discovering, and I just thank you all for sharing your stories today. So as we wrap up this afternoon's event, the remarks are concluded, and the second half of our celebration, because today is a celebration, is a reception on the 10th floor of the Woodruff Library, the Rose Library. We have incredible food, incredible wine and beer, and an exhibition curated by my colleague, Randy Gue, in partnership with Kathy Dixon and the CCR and Rose teams. So I welcome everybody to please, in this next part of our celebration, to head upstairs. There are elevators right around the corner from us on the 3rd floor. So you're just going to hit 10, and it might take a few minutes to get up there, but wait, get up there, join us for that. And until then, just another round of applause for our speakers and for the history that has been shared today.